Hi, my name is Don, and I am going to show you how to paint a watercolor painting today. Thank you so much for joining me for this adventure in watercolor painting. We're going to learn the tools that we use, we're going to learn the methodology that I use, and we're going to have a good time. So thank you again for joining me, and let's get started. Watercolor paper comes in two varieties. You can get it very thick, which has been made with layers and is more expensive, or you can get it thin, which is less expensive. The thicker paper comes in huge sheets that you can cut up, or what I like to do is tear it along the creases that I make after I have folded it. The thicker paper is more durable and you can scratch on it and abuse it without damaging. The thinner paper will warp a lot when it gets wet. The way to get around this is to tape the paper down to a board with the paper tape that has to be wet on the back. After it is taped down, then wet the paper thoroughly. It will warp a lot, but when it dries, it should warp a whole lot less. The next tools I use are brushes and other tools. I have a variety of sizes and textures of brushes. I also use palette knives, broken and good, for different edges. I have an old toothbrush which can be used for splattering paint on the painting to create interesting textures. I use an old soup can as a paintbrush holder. Of course, watercolor painting requires water. This is used water. Start out with a clean water and change it as often as you think it needs to be. The next thing I use is a plastic palette that can be purchased from Meiningers in Denver or any Hobby Lobby or Michaels. Mix your colors in a large area, and if you need to clean them, use Kleenex and water. I use Daniel Smith brand watercolor paints. Other brands are available for different price ranges. Arrange the colors on the palette in the way that you like. I put my yellow and earth colors in the bottom left, with not often used blues and greens and reds up on the top left side. Along the top, I have blues, black, dark blues like ultramarine blue, then medium blues and light blues. In the bottom right corner are red, light green, dark green, and brown. I use India ink along with a broken branch that can be dipped in the ink and used to make tree branches, grass, fence, wire, and many other objects in your paintings. An interesting tool is a sponge. Cut off a diagonal piece, take chunks out of it, and use it to create trees, grass, and other textures that give you more of an organic feel. Sprinkle salt on still wet painted areas. It reacts by repelling the pigments of the paint away from the salt, leaving whitish spots around it. This creates various textures that might even be said to impersonate snow. To mask out an area that you want to paint later, like a lightly colored tree in the foreground, use Misket, which comes in a bottle like this. Use a rubber-tipped brush to paint Misket onto the paint. If you paint it on with a real brush, you will ruin your brush. Now you can paint over the masked area, and when the paint dries, merely rub it off to reveal the unpainted paper. I use two kinds of erasers, a kneadable one and a hard-edged one. The kneadable eraser leaves no residue, while the hard eraser leaves residue that must be brushed off the paper. I use a hard pencil lead mounted in a drafter's pencil. A soft lead is too dark and is hard to erase. For scratching out tree branches or grass or highlighting areas, I use an X-Acto knife. Another medium that is helpful for creating highlights, as seen in this cow picture, are colored pencils. They can also be wetted with water and a paintbrush to bleed their color like watercolor paints. Lastly, use an inexpensive water spray bottle to go back and rework washes. I could go back into the sky in this painting, for example, and spray that area only then apply more paint, which would bleed and blossom in the wet areas. When picking a picture for painting, look for ones that have good composition. That is, pictures that have a strong focal point, images or shapes that draw your eye to that spot. Also, find pictures that have good scenery and things in the foreground that will draw your attention toward the focal point. Images with good coloring are ideal, but there are times when you will want to create your own coloring. But in most instances, it's nice to have something to follow. We are going to do this picture. This is in the Boulder Valley in the Absaroka Mountain Range in Montana. Because it is simple and has a foreground, a middle ground, which is the mountains, and a background, which is the sky in this case. The focal point will be that distant light blue mountain in the center. When doing the drawing, in most cases, we will not be trying to be very detailed in our sketch. Most of the time, all of the sketching will take place by just drawing in the shapes and the ideas of what we're going to do. In this case, I have a main mountain, which is our focal point, and we are going to put in other mountains that draw our eye toward the focal point. Sometimes you may have to redraw what you just did if it looks wrong. That's where the kneadable eraser comes in handy. We're just going to put in ideas of what we are going to use as trees. We are not going to draw the trees or fences with any detail. We are just going to put in the ideas of where they are going to be in the picture. This is also true for the items in the foreground. When drawing in the sky and the clouds, again, we are not going to put any detail, but we are only going to put in the shapes of the clouds where we want the blues and where we want the white. Notice that all the lines take your eye toward the distant mountain, the focal point. The next step after drawing is putting in our washes. We start out by putting down the water with our brush, and we are not going to brush water into the mountains. We are just going to get the area where the clouds are going to be. Because water is clear and sometimes hard to tell where I'm brushing it on, I often use the light reflection on the water to help me figure out where I'm putting the water. I will also use medium blue for my first wash. Notice when I put down the paint, it does what I call bleeding. That is, the water is a conduit that carries the pigment of paint throughout the areas that are wet. Use a good amount of paint. I also like to add different colors into the sky that will reflect what is in the foreground. I want to add some red, and I'm even going to put in some yellow with the red. Because the foreground does not impact the sky, or impact with the sky as the mountains are in between, I can also put washes down into the bottom part of the picture, into the foreground area. Again, I will wet the paper. Then I'm going to put in some brown and some earthy colors, just hints of these colors right now. This is the washing or bleeding stage. Later on, I'm going to go back and put more detail in, but right now, I'm just laying in color. I'm going to put in some dark areas. Notice, I'm putting in dark rust colors in the front, where sometimes I like to put things that will draw your eye toward the focal point. Notice that the distant mountain, our focal point, is light blue, but the closer mountains are a slightly darker blue, while the closest mountains tend towards green and even dark green. This is due to atmosphere, which causes things in the distance to be lighter and bluish. That is why the sky is blue. Light and sunshine also affect how things appear. The landscape has a sloping hill that begins in the very front of the picture and runs uphill from where we are standing, but then the hill slopes down towards a river that I know is at the base of these mountains. That is why the trees that are closer to me are big and tall, but the trees that are further away and on the back side of the hill are smaller. They are not only farther away, but they're also downhill so that we only see their tops. The tool I'll use to create the trees will be a sponge that has been cut off from a larger sponge. I then picked off pieces of it to give it a rough, unpredictable edge. In this painting, I made all the trees in the middle ground using the sponge by dabbing paint with it. For the mountains in the middle ground, I will use a smaller flat brush than I did for the sky. I will first paint the distant mountain a light blue. I'm not too concerned about staying in the lines because the darker colors of the closer mountains will cover up the light blue. If the paint is still wet in the light blue area, however, when I put in the closer mountains, the dark color will bleed into the light blue somewhat. As I lay down the darker blue, note the dry brush effect. But as I apply more paint and water, it will get covered up in the area and they create its own bleeds. Again, I'm not concerned if some of the blue runs into the other mountains. The darker colors will outmatch the lighter colors. Notice there are rock faces and other features on the mountain that I will put in later. I will also cover up much of the middle mountain with closer, larger, and darker trees. Putting down the darker blue does cause a bleed, but I will let that play it out on its own. Next, I will start introducing blue-green. As things get closer, the atmosphere is not as dominant, helping us to see the true color of the trees. Now we add even darker greens and impressions of trees. I don't want them to be very detailed, but I do want us to get the feeling of trees. I'll use a small pointed brush. I will also start adding in the front trees now with the sponge. Note how I dab it on, changing directions of how I dab so that the trees don't look the same. Remember that as trees get further away on the hill, they will go over the horizon line. As the artist, we can decide to follow the photo exactly, or we can choose to add more elements for the sake of viewer interest. Thus, I'm bringing trees closer to us than the picture shows. Now, I'm coming back with a small pointed brush with darker color on it to add depth and interest to the painting. We can use the brush to make trees also. Just make sure that they don't look like brush-made trees. Nature is varied, and we have to vary our techniques also. You can dab with a brush by jabbing it into the page to create interesting shapes and impressions of tree branches. Finish off the look with the sponge. Another technique, using the end of a flat brush, is used to give the impression of falling dead trees and branches. Note my brush handle has a hard edge that I scrape upward, applying more pressure at the beginning with no pressure at the end of the stroke. The wet paint will fill in the furrow I created with the brush, but the impression will remain. Make the strokes varied, taking some into the sky to create interest. We are done with this part of the painting, and we will let it dry before we come back to the foreground. We will create the foreground with the techniques called dry brush, which is painting with the brush onto a dry surface. I'll use a coarse-haired brush that tends to have the hairs separated so that as I drag it across the paper, I will see individual lines, some thin and others thick. Add in dark colors after the light brown. Now, go back with the vertical strokes to create the impression of grass. Note how the coarse hairs make individual lines. Now, let that dry. Notice the pencil lines from my sketch that can be seen in the sky. Sometimes you might want to leave some of those, and some artists do that in their drawings. But most of the time, you don't want these to be seen. Use a kneadable eraser to erase the lines. Where all the dark paint is, the lines, however, won't show up, and you don't need to erase them. The distant mountain still has some snow on it. I'll use the X-Acto knife to scrape away the surface paint and even paper to create the impression of snow. Look at nature, and you'll notice that everything has highlights and darks created by sunlight. If you make a mistake, it just adds to the painting. The fence posts are barely visible in the foreground that I had drawn earlier, but now I'll add those in. I'll use a dark brown and not make them straight and true but crooked and old. Dab the paint with a Kleenex for texture. Then come back to add in the shadows on the unlighted side of the posts. Use the coarsehair brush to add more grass and texture and interest. Here I'm dabbing with the brush instead of stroking with it. By putting in the darker grass in the bottom left-hand corner, I am giving the eye a starting point to start its upward cycle towards the focal point. Then the posts will force the viewer's eye across the picture towards the focal point. This is in addition to the movement of the clouds and the direction of the mountains and the trees. All of these are meant to draw us to the focal point, the distant mountain. To add more character and interest to the painting, I'll use the X-Acto knife again to scratch some old dead trees into the scene. I'm following the path of the scraping done earlier with the paintbrush handle. The sharper the angle of the knife is applied, the deeper it cuts into the painting surface, and more paint and paper is removed. The more flat of the blade that is used will only cause a discoloration. Distant areas have less severe scratching. Use the knife to give the impression of light on the posts. Use the smaller pointed brush to create cast shadows on the ground from the posts. The stroke is heavier at the beginning to no pressure at all at the end. Sign the painting using the same style that you have for all of your paintings and put the date. You never know how famous you may become. The date will help verify the validity of the painting. I put the signature in one of the bottom corners that has a lighted background. I use a small pointed brush with dark paint.
Hi, this is Tim from High Plains Library District. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Don Ruth for helping us with this awesome tutorial video. You can check out his website, donruththeworks.com, for more tutorials and amazing paintings. You can also check out our website, mylibrary.us, for information about the libraries, or you can call us at 888-861-7323. Thanks again and have a great day.